Well, welcome everyone to this fourth and final webinar in this year's Melbourne Forum on Constitution Building in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Tom Daly from the Constitution Transformation Network, and I'll be your chair today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm located, the Boonwurrung, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land throughout Australia, and to pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. Now, this is our fifth Melbourne Forum, which is held annually as a flagship collaboration between the Constitution Transformation Network, ConTransNet, and International IDEA, and it's the first we've held as a webinar series. The overarching theme for this year's forum has been representation in democracies during emergencies, and we've been shining a light on the diverse Asia-Pacific region through discussion of a wide range of case studies. Now, with the focus on representation, we've naturally been speaking so far a lot about elected actors, whether that's the performance of presidents or parliaments, the functioning of different levels of government or interaction among different levels. But today we're switching tack to focus on unelected actors who've also been a vital part of the COVID-19 response across the region. So we're talking about courts, about fourth branch institutions like public health task forces and human rights and electoral commissions, and international organizations. And it's such an important discussion because, as we all know, there's been a widespread backlash against accountability institutions, experts and multilateral institutions in recent years. And we've had much talk this year about how the COVID crisis has shown just how much we need them. So we're delighted to have four speakers with us today. First, we'll have Dinesha Samararatne speaking about Sri Lanka, then Richard Naidu on Fiji Islands, Jiunn-rong Yeh on Taiwan, and Rohan Edrisinha on international institutions and representation. We'll also be closing out this final session with reflections on all four webinars from Leena Tamang, Director of IDEA's Asia and the Pacific Regional Programme, and Cheryl Saunders, convener of ConTransNet here at Melbourne Law School. We're also delighted that the Secretary General of International IDEA, Mr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, will be closing the event. Now, before we move to the panelists, a few very quick housekeeping notes. First is that each panelist will be speaking for 5 minutes. The aim, as ever, is to ensure that we have as much time for discussion and Q&A as possible. If you wish to pose a question during the session, simply click Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And of course, I encourage our guests, including former panelists who are not speaking today, to raise questions too. Please also note that this session is being recorded. And finally, don't forget that if you're tweeting, the hashtags are MELBForum2020 and MF5. So with that said, I'll hand over to our first speaker, my ConTransNet colleague, Dinesha Samararatne. Dinesha.
Thank you very much, Tom. And hello to everybody. I must say it's a delight for me to be speaking at this final webinar of the Melbourne Forum, which is being conducted virtually this time. I've been associated with the Melbourne Forum since 2018 and also with ConTransNet. And I must say each time I attend the Melbourne Forum, I'm convinced about the need to understand constitutional governance in the Asia-Pacific region on its own terms. And the three webinars so far, and I'm sure this webinar too, will be a good reminder to us of the need to continue to do this in our attempts at advancing constitutional governance. So let me turn to Sri Lanka and look at it as a case study for today's discussion on issues beyond representation. Today, I will draw on my paper to make the following points very briefly. Firstly, I will provide a brief overview of the Sri Lankan context as it's relevant for today's theme. Secondly, I will highlight the insights that we can gain on issues beyond representation from the specific Sri Lankan experience. And then thirdly, I will assess the impact of these experiences for constitutional governance more broadly. let me begin by noting that for all intents and purposes at the moment, community transmission of COVID-19 in Sri Lanka has been effectively brought under control. And in that regard, the government has been effective and Sri Lanka's international borders remain closed. Now, going back, since the 1940s, Sri Lanka has maintained a state-funded public healthcare system, which has by and large been effective throughout the years. In terms of communicable diseases, Sri Lanka's main challenge in the last 3 decades or so has been the spread of dengue fever. And interestingly, the military and the police have been co-opted routinely to support the prevention of the spread of dengue fever in Sri Lanka. Now, the pandemic hit the country at a politically significant time. And the details of this are available in my paper. The new president was elected in November 2019, dissolved parliament in early March, and elections were scheduled to be held on the 25th of April. By 20th March, the country was placed under curfew. It is also important to note that the Sri Lankan government did not at any stage declare a state of emergency, which is provided for under the Constitution. Now to turn to the insights on issues beyond representation from the Sri Lankan experience. A striking feature of Sri Lanka's response was the use of 2 presidential task forces to respond to the pandemic. These task forces were outside the established executive and administrative structures, but were mandated to work through them. This was a model which gave the president a wide margin of discretion in determining the government's response to the pandemic. Parliament remained dissolved during this time, despite some calls for Parliament to be reconvened. Sri Lanka's success in dealing with the pandemic thus far is evidence that this approach was successful and definitely catered for the safety and well-being of the majority of the people. However, as I point out in my short paper, questions related to the legality and constitutionality of some of these measures remain. However, given the material and practical success of these measures, for most Sri Lankans, there is very little concern in public debate on these questions of legality or constitutionality. Now, an interesting contrast is the public perception about the Easter Sunday attacks in April 2019 and the constitutional institutions or structures. There is a sense that the lack of coordination which may have led to the failure to prevent the tragedy can be attributed, at least in part, to the reduction of the power of the executive presidency under the 19th Amendment that was introduced in 2015. And I'll come back to this shortly. The capacity and strength of Sri Lanka's independent commissions was also tested during this time. As I discuss in the paper, the legality of the postponement of the parliamentary elections by the Elections Commission remains an issue. However, here too, events eventually took over these legal or constitutional questions. On the 4th of August, the Elections Commission conducted the election successfully with a 76% voter turnout and in compliance with public health guidelines. During this time, the Human Rights Commission too continued to fulfill its mandate. A notable intervention by the Commission was a letter written to the President recommending the regularization of the restriction of the freedom of movement that was imposed through the imposition of the curfew. Finally, with regard to the impact of these issues beyond representation to constitutional governance. The response of the government of Sri Lanka to the pandemic amplifies the current tendencies of the executive in relation to representation, public institutions, and to constitutional governance. Executive dominance in the current political landscape has meant that other constitutional and legal institutions are compelled to follow the directions of the executive rather than perform a checking function. Moreover, the success of the government in dealing with the pandemic has, in my view, at least in part, enabled it to propose rolling back the restrictions to the office of the executive presidency, that were introduced by the 19th Amendment in 2015 by way of a 20th Amendment, which was tabled in Parliament yesterday. And we can discuss this later in the discussion time if it comes up. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Dinesha. Such an interesting paper, such an interesting presentation. That idea of being cooperative rather than constraining the executive is something I'm sure we'll be picking back up. So I'm moving to Richard, who's going to speak to us about Fiji Islands.
All right, Tom, thank you. Hi, everybody. And I'm sorry that this is my the first time I've actually been able to join. It's always hard to tell a commercial lawyer that he can only speak for 5 minutes because, of course, we bill in 6-minute units. So that's just not something we're used to at all. I'm sorry also that my paper arrived so late, but I'm hoping that everybody's at least had a chance to glance at it. And I think what I'd like to do is perhaps just go in the 5 minutes that I've got, and obviously come back to whatever we want to in discussion. The final slide, where I say that really reflecting on, in some cases, the almost comedic events that have happened in Fiji and which are reflected in the presentation. But there's a pattern here. Those of you who know me will be unsurprised that I have a fairly cynical view of the current Fiji constitution, the fourth we've had in 50 years, following on from our fourth or our fifth coup, depending on how you define military coups. But this is one of our imposed constitutions. And it's a constitution that, in my view, takes human rights pretty lightly, creates a very heavy-handed executive that has considerable power over constitutional officers and indeed even the judiciary. So it's probably not that surprising that our COVID response, medically, like Sri Lanka, we have been successful. We closed the borders early. We've confined our cases to 2 deaths, and even those deaths I don't think occurred as a result of transmission in Fiji. So we've been very successful at containing the outbreak. Of course, the economic consequences when you're a country heavily dependent on tourism will follow. And I've got no doubt that that will create other human rights and constitutional issues. But overall, the response was very top-down. The government seemed to assume that because the Prime Minister gave a press conference setting out various orders, that everything else ought to follow. So it took us 14 days after that to actually document any legal orders, with some consequences, because the result of that was that certain people who were arrested for curfew breaches, there really was nothing behind the so-called laws that they were charged with disobeying. And a couple of quite silly examples are included in the presentation. The poor priest who asks, where is the lawful order I'm accused of disobeying? And is told, well, it's there on the screenshot of the Prime Minister's Facebook presentation. It's the case that the police seem to treat everybody as just liable to 48 hours, almost mandatory detention. Nobody's really having any regard to a curfew breaker being released. They're simply held for 48 hours and produced. And I think possibly the other feature, bearing in mind that we've got no effective human rights commission that is actually able to stand up and speak up for rights, is only very busy reminding us that our rights have limitations, is that the courts themselves, and the High Court in particular, seems to have moved very swiftly to squash any outbreak, whether it be by a magistrate who sees problems in some of these charges, or indeed another High Court judge saying, this is all getting a bit ridiculous. We've got literally thousands or hundreds of people We think in excess of 2,000 people who have actually been convicted, who now have criminal records as a result of a curfew breach and the consequences for those people. Whereas the High Court seems to be very swift in sort of enforcing and underlining the very strict and tough line that our executive wants to take in terms of punishing people for even minor breaches. So I think I've had my 5 minutes. I might stop there unless there are any questions that I can answer now. Tom?
Thank you so much, Richard. I was really struck in your characterization of the overall response in your slides as, never mind the constitutional system, we've got a virus to deal with here. And I think that resonates in so many countries. So thank you for unpacking that, and we'll be coming back to it in the discussion. So we're going to move on to Jiunn-rong Yeh, speaking to us about Taiwan.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's so good to share with you some of the salient features of the fight against the convict in Taiwan. Well, as one of the CNN reporters saying that if you visit Taipei City on the street, you find it's so surreal to see how people is doing right now. It looks pretty much similar to pre-convict pandemic and after convict pandemic, because life is so much normal here in Taiwan. And also the statistics show that in Taiwan, only 509 confirmed cases with only 7 deaths. And people begin to ask why, I mean, theoretically and also practically, to see whether we have very, good government, or we have good people, or we have good law, or we have good technology. I put in my small essay saying that there are 4 legs to stand on: democracy, community, law, and technology. But in this short period, 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about, highlight some of those. I will begin by responding to the topic that is beyond representation: independent and international institutions. Let me begin by talking about international. It's not going to be in the national representative terms, but in international community, I think Taiwan may be one of the few who are rejected by WHO and not represented in WHO. So it's fit quite squarely with that beyond representation, internationally, or under representation, well, no matter, depending on how you look at it. So a country so close to China with very sort of close tie, I mean, in terms of human flow or, investment and tourists, but was able to do that in an efficient way. Respond very early, in a very early time, taking up some of the very efficient and measures, but not very dramatic ones. So there has been no lockdown, no compulsory testing. The university and schools remain open, and so. With very minimum threat to human rights and rule of law. I would say right now, Taiwan still hope that they can have a meaningful and meaningful participation in the international community, in the hope that they can offer, and in some way they can get help, but at the same time they can also help. They can also offer some of their experience to that, particularly this one. And here is something I would like to say. Let me begin with court. Okay, has something to do with SARS last time. Taiwan did very poorly during SARS, outbreak, Taiwan suffered so much, resulting in a complete lockdown of a major hospital. And there were lawsuits. People sued in the court, and later on, the Constitutional Court rendered a decision asking for the Congress to revise the Communicable Disease Control Act. And that was the beginning of some of the awareness that we should make this law ready for next attack. So they began to build up that, and including compensation, including remedy, habeas corpus protection, and all kinds of measures were done more reasonably in the law. So before the outbreak, we have already have a more reasonable law to deal with this convict to start with. So this is something very, very important. But at the same time, we try to reflect at that time, because during SARS, Taiwan tried to get access to the information or to the sample, but got rejected. But rejected all the time. And that's why Taiwan learned that they have to rely on their war. They need to move faster, and they need to work harder than the rest of the country. And that's what Taiwan have learned. So starting from this, the beginning, actually, there was the very end of last year, our health official and also medical community, they put themselves on alert and have begun to work on this even before WHO, took some action. So they noticed something, and they even warned WHO about this possible break. So starting from there, they took decisive decision.
I think we might have lost Jiunn-rong for a second. Does anybody want to jump in with a question just while we're waiting for this tech issue to be resolved?
Okay, I have finished my time, and I think maybe I can add up some of the point as we have move on to that. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jiunn-rong. It's really striking to me how, if we look at independent institutions, we almost see a spectrum from Fiji, where Richard's, one of his slides says about institutions saying they will just do whatever the government asks them to do or tells them to do, to Sri Lanka, where there's been some pushback with the Human Rights Commission, and then to Taiwan, where, as I read it and as I understand it, they've been quite central and very active. And it would be good to pick up that point again. But I want to move to our fourth speaker, Rohan Edrisinha, speaking about international institutions and representation.
Thank you, Tom. What I would like to do is highlight three issues. The first is with respect to the role of the United Nations, and the second and third issues are connected to representation and deliberation, and some of the issues that came up in the earlier session. I think it's interesting that we're focusing on the role of the United Nations as it celebrates its 75th anniversary. And just earlier this week, the Secretary General of the UN said, in this 75th anniversary year, we face our own 1945 moment. And I think in some of his speeches, as part of the celebrations, he's been stressing the need for multilateralism, coordination, and international cooperation. Now, I'd like to suggest that even though the UN hasn't always lived up to its ideas, and there is a lot of legitimate criticism that can be made of the United Nations, that we need to recognize its distinctive role. And I think its distinctiveness is partly because of its representativeness. And since the theme of our conference is representation, I thought I should highlight this. It is a member states-based organization. And as I often say, the United Nations is only as good as its member states allow it to be. And member states, unfortunately, whenever they take decisions in the General Assembly or in the United Nations fora like the World Health Assembly with respect to the WHO, they are always motivated by self-interest and an obsession with national sovereignty. But the fact that it is a member states-based organization gives it a certain role, distinctive role. Every member state wants to have buy-in and is therefore a stakeholder. Secondly, it is the reality that powerful countries, not only countries on the Security Council, play a dominant role in the life and work of the UN. That's the reality. But as a countervailing force to that, you have the fact that the UN is a norms-based institution. The Charter, the covenants, and the fourth aspect of the UN is the Secretary General and the UN staff who try to work within this dynamic and use the Charter and use the norms whenever they can to try and promote UN values. And I tried to suggest in my paper that even within countries, you have this interplay of forces. So for example, in Sri Lanka today, the resident coordinator is trying to use the non-threatening aspects of the UN, the WHO, work on poverty and work with children to engage with the government, while at the same time trying to engage the government on the more controversial, sensitive issues dealing with reconciliation, transitional justice, etc. And it all depends on the skill of UN staff to be able to use that. The second point that I'd like to make is that I feel very strongly that the COVID-19 crisis in our part of the world might suggest, it certainly is the case in Sri Lanka, that emergency situations are the norm rather than the exception. And if you look at Sri Lanka, the public perception is we've had so many years of terrorism with the Tamil Tigers, we had the Easter Sunday attacks, now we have the COVID pandemic. And so we basically need a strong leader, we need action, we need efficiency, we need discipline, rather than deliberation, dissent, minority rights used in the broad sense. And so I'd just like to add to what Dinesha said. It's very interesting that the government chose not to use the state of emergency option and other legislation because they wanted to have absolute executive convenience, not be constrained by any kind of legal framework. And so all those measures that Dinesha described were probably contra-constitutional. So they were effective, as Dinesha said, but my question is, at what price? Is it that the price was constitutionalism and all the norms of the rule of law? And my last point, very briefly, is that I think that we need to really look at what the role of parliament is in constitutional democracy. And in Sri Lanka today, there is a total lack of confidence in our parliament. And I suggest that this is because we have been focusing on electoral system design in terms to look at inclusion and fairness in terms of representation. And we have forgotten to bear in mind that we're also designing a parliament. And a parliament has very specific functions. Accountability and scrutiny of the executive have been mentioned, but I would also like to toss into that the notion of deliberation. I think that parliament is fundamentally a deliberative assembly, and I think that we've lost that. We're losing that in this part of the world, and we need to really revisit it to ask, do we still expect parliament to perform that deliberative function, or do we need to rethink the role of parliament? And because I'm up for time, I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can continue this during the Q&A time. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Rohan. I was really struck once again in your paper about how the issue of executive aggrandizement and hyper-presidentialism in Sri Lanka just brings us back to that question of, if you have a government that makes no space for anything but its own power, how can you have any space for independent institutions at either the national or the international level. And I think that's something that's far beyond Sri Lanka as a problem. I see a number of questions coming through, but I might just open up to if anybody has any questions on our guest panel first, while I'm just working through these and picking through them. Cheryl.
Yeah, look, that was a fantastic series of presentations. Thank you. Can I just make one of many observations I'd like to make? One drawing on Jiunn-rong's piece, where he describes the way Taiwan learnt from its emergency powers in the last pandemic and prepared them in a way that achieved a better balance for this pandemic. That really struck me because for those of us who didn't endure the last pandemic in the same way, or certainly didn't take the same lessons from it, I've been sitting looking at what's been going on in all our countries thinking, as soon as this is over, we've really got to start working on this. And I just wonder whether there's anybody else who's seeing any signs of a willingness to pick up and learn from this experience so as to put more durable and satisfactory arrangements in place in the future. But in doing that, I'm also struck by the point that Rohan just made about the people of Sri Lanka enduring perpetual crises. And that one of the things that this pandemic has shown us is that when health and life is really at risk, we rely very heavily on the state to do stuff and try and deal with the health crisis. And so one of the challenges in designing our emergency procedures for the future is to take that really quite understandable human reaction into account at the same time. So I'm not sure that's a question so much as a series of thoughts prompted by those very interesting positions that we've just heard.
Thanks, Cheryl. Do any of our speakers want to offer a quick response to those really interesting comments? No, we might move in that case just to some of the questions that are coming through from our audience. So I'm looking at one here. It asks, don't you think that the COVID-19 pandemic systematically undermines democracy and paves the way for a universal wave of authoritarianism? I'd be very interested to hear your views on that. Can I start with Dinesha?
Thank you, Tom. So my sense thus far, I think we are still in the midst of this pandemic, is to say that actually what it's doing is it's amplifying the strengths and weaknesses of a given constitutional democracy. And because I'm currently based in Melbourne, but my research interest lies very much with Sri Lanka, I get to compare two very different democracies responding to this problem. And that my sense is that in both cases, it's amplifying what's already there in terms of, particularly in terms of weaknesses, but also in terms of strengths. So as Rohan mentioned before, Sri Lanka has been ruled effectively by emergency since the late 70s, if not the early 80s. And during this pandemic, we've seen another version of that emergency by rule. And this time you could easily argue that it's gone a step further. Whereas in Melbourne, it's a different approach altogether. There is very much a concern about constitutionality, legality, policy, evidence, reasons. And that perhaps might be Australia's strength. So I would hesitate in drawing global trends based on how countries are responding to the pandemic. I think there is a high degree of variation, and it's in trying to understand those variations that perhaps, like Cheryl said, we can better prepare for similar disasters or crises in the future.
Thanks, Dinesha. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that you know, in some places it's actually reminded us of how much these institutions are needed and to have the proper balance rather than steamrollering. Does anybody else want to pick up Jiunn-rong?
Yes. I think the pandemic provides us with sort of window to see how different countries with their social, historical, political context and constitutional structure, government structure, respond to this, the same thing, but may in different way. So it provides a very sort of good cases for us to do comparison, in the future and now. I do not think this is, it is clear that it is a failure of democracy or triumph of the democracy or democratic consolidation issue. You may have different claim, but until we have some more competitive studies, it's not good to jump to the conclusion. From the perspective of Taiwan, for example, let me share with you some of my observation. I found that Taiwan, before COVID, was a very contested democracy, that citizens are very vigilant, very watchful, very critical about the government. And they remain critical, but in a different way. We know the legitimacy of the government for the executive in administrative law context. We know there is a green light theory and red light theory. I found out Taiwan citizens and community usually use red light theory to look into governmental operation. Whenever they come up with something, they begin to suspect that, and even suing in a court. And citizen groups are very, very watchful and engaged. But this time I found, because of the good performance of the government and the expert-led government, particularly the health department, and then now our superstar is the, doctor with doctor background, doctor background minister. He actually brief the case, brief the situation, answer question every day, 2 o'clock. Every citizen like to listen to that. So they explain every case, to the citizen. So build up public trust. So I found out that it has turned into, and very rare, all in my life in Taiwan's, politics, I found this is the moment that citizens begin to use the red light theory. So they call that clockwise, because the name of the minister is clock, and clockwise or anti-clockwise. Now most of the people are clockwise. Whatever the command center, say about the policy, people like to follow. And people believe that they follow with good reason, not because that this is an authoritarian imposition of something. And community began to build awareness to do cooperative job and to do that, autonomous work in order to fight together. So this is my observation. Maybe we should do more competitive things. And I think this question is really, very challenging and very good question for us.
Absolutely, thank you. Just before I move on the question to others, can I ask just a very quick follow-up question? I was struck in your paper about how the president is envisaged as the crisis leader in the Constitution, but that actually was the Central Epidemic Command Center that was actually the central actor. Was that seen as a delegation by the president or a displacement of the president?
Well, normally in other countries, you see the president or the premier come out and hold conference, attract all the media, right? This time, the president stay in the back, and the capable minister, and helped by experts, medical experts, they talk about something, with scientific basis and very easy to understand for. So they sort of give the credit to the president in this way. So president is not running out for the election or for other things, and fight for, exposure and fight for something. No, the president sit there and just support. And I think this is her approval rate just increased dramatically. She is now very, very popular, not by not doing too much, but that the experts, that the bureaucrat, that the cabinet do things accordingly. So this is rather very interesting to me also.
Yes, popularity through inaction.
Not inaction, but deliberate and also very prudent, way of doing things.
Thank you so much. I want to hear from our other two speakers, but I also see that we have two hands up. We've Jiunn and Leena are in the queue. So can we hear from Jiunn first, please?
Thank you, Tom. I learned a lot from your presentation. I got a lot of lessons and insights from each of them. Yeah. For the Sri Lanka case, several points were very impressive. One of them was cremation, which I've never thought about in my country. Yeah, but one of them was, which I picked to ask, is as follows. Considering many high courts or constitutional court already hesitate to rule on the matters during the pandemic related to COVID-19 cases in other jurisdictions, Sri Lanka Supreme Court ruled on the overall curfew in May already, right? Then the Supreme Court applied the proportionality test to rule on the non-exceptional curfew or not? I am wondering about that. Do you think, Dinesha, do you think such involvement of Supreme Court during pandemic was helpful and positively accessible? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiunn. Dinesha.
Thanks, Yongin, for that question. So the curfew, the issue of the legality of the curfew came up before a magistrate's court because a person was arrested and detained, and that came up before the magistrate's court. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I had a look at the judgment in the magistrate's court, and they do engage in some analysis on the reasons for the curfew and make some reference to the legality of it. But in the court, they did conclude that there was a legal basis for the curfew. And of course, some of us have disagreed with that decision of the court. I guess more than the question of the proportionality, the question would be as to the very basis of the curfew. And that's where we disagree, because we do have provision for police curfew, but as I indicated in my short paper, the curfew went on for several weeks, whereas police curfew is meant as a temporary measure. And that's why a state of emergency and emergency regulations under that state of emergency would have been the constitutional pathway for the restriction of freedom that was imposed during that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dinesha. Leena.
Thank you. Rohan, you discussed the parliament as representative body promoting inclusion, as well as parliament as a forum for deliberation, scrutiny, public accountability, and the tension between those two. And well, I think you're probably right. But in a way, my question is, where does that lead us toward in terms of any policy advice? I presume you're not saying less inclusion, or are you? And equally, I guess the question of role of parliament is also very relevant in Fiji. How do you see, Richard, on Elizabeth, the role of parliament in Fiji in managing this the pandemic, or the response to pandemic rather?
Thank you, Leena. Rohan?
Thanks, Leena. Thanks for giving me an opportunity of clarifying my position. I just think that when we're talking about electoral system design, we need to factor in the question of parliament as a deliberative assembly as well. And I suspect that in Nepal and Sri Lanka in particular, we've been focusing, maybe we haven't been getting the balance right, and focusing a lot more on inclusion. In terms of policy recommendations, I would think that we need to think of either constitutional or legal provisions, or make it part of the electoral system sort of package that's going to be in the constitution, or partly in the constitution and partly in law, to look at things like intra-party democracy, the regulation of political parties, and campaign finance reform. Because my hunch is that in Sri Lanka, as I try to explain in the short paper, all that has contributed to a different type of politician, coming forward to contest elections. And I think we need to be mindful of that. So I'm certainly not saying that inclusion, proportional representation systems, etc., are not important. And the other thing, of course, my little hobby horse is the question of the freedom of conscience of MPs, the relationship between an MP and a party, this notion that Parliament should not consist of a Congress of ambassadors of parties, but representatives of the people. So a little bit more thought on all this. And Tom, if you don't mind, a quick comment on Sri Lanka. I actually think that the courts, it wasn't a question of proportionality or anything like that. I mean, the courts basically abdicated their responsibility. So I feel a little bit more strongly about this than Dinesha does. There was as you know, there was a fundamental rights case before the Supreme Court to deal with the whole of the government's response. And the court basically just did not even give the petitioners leave to proceed. It was just total abdication. They didn't want to antagonize the executive. Thanks.
Thank you. I really want to return to this issue actually, because there is that question of how much of the performance of independent institutions is predicated on having no space to act or abdicating the responsibility, as you put it, which is a different way of looking at it. And how much courage we expect from independent institutions. And if one institution can be a leader, for example, for others. I want to return to that, but I do want to leave space for Richard to answer Leena's question.
Thanks, Leena. And I might answer that question by sort of joining it up with the earlier question about whether or not this crisis is encouraging universal authoritarianism. I think what the crisis does is it underscores, if you like, the democratic profiles that countries already have. It tends to concentrate, the position that we're already in. In Fiji, we have effectively a parliamentary dictatorship. So we have a parliament which is not given much respect by the ruling party. 3 weeks ago, they passed 7 bills under urgency, all with 1 hour debate. Just used their majority to approve urgency. 1 hour's debate ran through 7 changes in law. So bills were produced on Monday for the first time. By Thursday, they were law, and all after 1 hour's debate. And so in essence, we've got a country in Fiji where the executive just doesn't care, and if you look at it in terms of what I've set out in my presentation on Fiji, we compare Fiji, say, and of course we do, with our geographic neighbor New Zealand. And New Zealand's won many plaudits, I think, for its leadership in the crisis, the consultative way it's approached things, the excellent communication, of their prime minister. And it's interesting, just before we started talking about a case where apparently similar to Fiji, although with a very different outcome, it was shown that a law had been effectively implemented, but it had been gotten wrong. Now in New Zealand, I think the courts rule in that way, and they say, right, and everybody just accepts it. Well, we messed up. Very sorry about that. In Fiji, by contrast, when a court points out a weakness in a law that ought to result in one of the 2,500 people arrested for breaching a curfew avoiding a conviction. There's only 900,000 of us, and we've already prosecuted, more than 2,000. And most of these people are suffering convictions. But when a court points out that there is a problem with the prosecution, rather than the government letting it go and saying, okay, fine, we've learned a lesson, the government, in fact, acts in a way that seems to distort the whole court process, because the government must win. Whatever happens, the government must win. They're not prepared to let one case go here or there and learn the lessons that the courts could teach them. The government would rather win at whatever cost that comes to, in terms of how the courts are regarded and how the courts operate.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so telling that what should be seen as a sort of a baked-in constraint that is a normal part of governance is seen as, in principle, as a challenge to the government. I really want to pick up this point further, but I do have a question from Amanda. Amanda.
Thank you so much, Tom. My question actually builds quite a bit on Richard and Rohan's comments, but also I think on all of these different sessions that we've had in this year's Melbourne Forum. I'm really interested in the idea of, once we emerge, Cheryl also mentioned, how are we going to design for these institutions in the future, in the way that we've seen many of the Asian and Pacific countries prepared based on the SARS and MERS virus. But if we think about constitutional design, I think we see in a lot of these examples that there were designs for checks and balances, whether it's multi-level governance, independent institutions, parliamentary oversight over the executive. But in practice, in a lot of the case studies we've looked at, because of capture of many of these institutions by one party, or it's actually effectively undermining a lot of those checks and balances, despite what could be in theory seen as very good designs. So it's a question actually kind of for everybody, but going forward, thinking about preparing for these pandemics in the future, how can we design in a way that we don't, or maybe try to avoid capture, which would weaken the oversight and checks and balances in different branches of government. And I don't know, I'm definitely thinking about the Philippines. I see Ella here, but I think Sri Lanka is a good example. Pakistan, we had some good examples from as well. So anyone can answer that.
I think it was it more closely directed to Rohan, or will I leave it open?
It's fairly open, but maybe Rohan or anyone can really jump in. I'm just curious, thinking through the future, how we try to improve design of these systems.
Great. I think we'll hand over to Rohan, and we can move from there. Rohan.
So I'm not sure it's a answer to or a proper response to Amanda's question, but I really think that we've got to focus on public opinion and educating the people, because for me in Sri Lanka, I'm just shocked that no one seems to share my concerns or Dinesha's concerns. People are quite happy to let the executive basically take over and do what it wants. And I do think that we need to reflect on how we've got it wrong. Are we in our education methods, our communication methods? And I think that, to me, is the long-term solution.
Thanks, Rohan. That interestingly links up with one of the questions from our audience, actually, where it's a slightly different question, but they ask, why are educated people not obeying the COVID rules, even after several reminders that this is another issue for spreading the virus globally? Is there any solution? And I suppose public education in all sort of manifestations comes in here, doesn't it? Does anybody want to pick up that point based on either our panelists or otherwise? Cheryl.
Can I just say something about Amanda's point as sort of filtered through Rohan? I mean, I'm not sure that it is just about design. So sometimes it's about design. So if we look at the various constitutional emergency powers that we looked at in the first session, there were some obvious points about design that could be picked up and thought through in the context of different kinds of emergencies. But I think it's much broader than that. I mean, I think it's partly the public education point that Rohan pointed to, and that not just education in a top-down way, but really, somehow these ideas seeping into the bones of the people for whom these constitutional systems exist. But maybe it's even more than that. It's dealing with the conceptual underpinnings of what we think we're on about. I mean, Rohan made a plea in his observations for deliberation in parliaments, and I am 100% with him. But it's by no means the received view about what Parliament's there for. There are a lot of people in the world, particularly in the Westminster tradition, who think that Parliament is there to give the government legitimacy and just to accept whatever's put to them. And until we come to grips with this argument about what legislatures are actually there for, I think it's going to be very hard to get the message through to people, and certainly very hard to get it through to members of Parliament. So this sort of discussion is very useful to flush those things out, but then we've got to be prepared to run with them.
I think this is linking with the questions we've received, which are asking, is the Chinese model the future of governance? Which of course is a state where all arms of the state are in lockstep, and the executive gets its say on everything. The others are only there to parcel out the work to. So bringing it back to independent institutions, from our 3 country case studies here, or any country case studies represented here, does anybody have a view on how is it possible to build the capacity of independent institutions from a low base? How do you get there? Is it a question of leadership within those institutions? Is it a mixture of that and design? It's one of the questions. Jiunn-rong.
Well, I think Tom's question related to one of your earlier remarks. You were saying that whether the court just didn't get a chance to do, her job, or simply because some of the inconvenience or some of the strategic, consideration. So my response to that is that we need to provide the opportunity institutionally for this independent institution to do the job. At least we need to provide that, particularly in a time of crisis like this. Let me say, for example, when Taiwan began come up with a special law for COVID-19, because of the earlier judicial decision, so they put a habeas corpus protection in the law. If you are put in quarantine for 14 days and you discontent with this order, you can go to the court asking for help. So number one, this is important because it opened up. Maybe it's not going to be used. Maybe it's going to be used. And I was happy to see the first case in Taipei. A woman from Hong Kong, originally from Hong Kong, he was put into a designated hotel for quarantine, but she was not happy. So she filed a complaint to Taipei court, and court respond in a very speedy way, but with very thorough deliberation about how this should be articulated. And I think this is good to the society. With that opportunity and also one practice, and court got a chance to respond to only one case. But I, as a constitutional scholar, I value that case very much, for example. So what I'm saying is that, number one, provide the opportunity through law or through institution to those institutions, and then try to see whether they can actually do the job and try to value those very rare case, and that society would honor that kind of spirit.
So really about seizing the opportunities that come to the institution itself.
Right.
Does anybody want to pick up on that point, or does anybody want to jump in with a different question?
Can I say something? Sorry.
Sorry, Dinesha, go ahead.
Thank you. So this is also response to the exchange we had previously about public opinion and public education. I mean, I agree fully with what Rohan and Cheryl said. And in addition to that, I think, at least in Sri Lanka's case, we are seeing this understanding, whether it's right or wrong, is a different debate, but there seems to be this perception that government works best when it's centralized, and that centralized government will look after the general interests of the majority. The minority may be affected, but by and large, it will work for the majority. And where this sense comes from is, I mean, it's difficult to pin it down, but I do wonder whether the colonial state, which also came in with this logic of it works for us, so it's acceptable, has something to do with it, whether that has been our experience of government in the modern period and whether that has something to do with this as well. So in addition to sort of building public opinion and looking at education, I feel there's also this challenging task of responding to this argument that if something works, it should be good. That we need to take that on if we want to defend the values of constitutionalism as being the better approach.
Because we have to grapple with the question of output legitimacy. If it works at the other end, who cares about how the sausage is made, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, Dinesha. So Richard, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just picking up on a couple of the things. I just wanted to pick up, I think, on Cheryl's comment in respect of design. I mean, we start almost at a different situation. We've got a bad design to start with. And Cheryl knows very well the issues in our constitution. So the question, I suppose, is whether or not design is the issue, because Rohan talks about education. It seems to me that we need some activism. We need people just to keep driving. I mean, we have a constrained parliament, we have a constrained court system, but they're still there. And whether or not, you know, there are people who are prepared to use them. So I think activism is important, and support for activists where that can be provided is important. I think also we've got to get behind, if you can call them this, good governments when we have them. Governments which actually do have democratic instincts as opposed to governments that have authoritarian instincts in the same, you know, under the same system. And just help those governments with democratic instincts, the good guys, if you like, future-proof the institutions for when they go out of power. I mean, you talk about education. I was interested in what Rohan had to say about sort of lack of interest in Sri Lanka around various issues. In Fiji, and I think I touched on this in one of the points, our curfew continues. We actually have no COVID-19 cases, but our curfew continues between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Why? Because the Prime Minister has said it's popular. He's not even pretending anymore that it's about health. He's saying it's popular. And yet there is, again, no real interest in anybody asking the question, why do we have it then? And is this correct? Is this right? And so I think there is a need for education and activism, but as I say, let's use the resources of good governments when we have them to boost the institutions, not just say, because we have a good government in power right now, everything is fine. We've actually got to future-proof those institutions against governments of a different shade.
Mm. So that's really interesting. In constitution building, we often talk about windows of opportunity, and this is sort of more like the windows for institutional reinforcement for the future. That's really interesting. Once again, it's about making the most of the opportunities and the moments. Does anybody want to follow up what's just been said? I do have a question coming in, so I can put that to you. So we've just had a question in asking, where is space in constitutionalism to trust the people? A deliberative design might shift the role of representative government to facilitate communication between the people, between independent institutions and the people. I might ask Rohan, seeing as he mentioned the issue of public education.
Okay, Tom, I'll have a shot at it. I mean, I fully endorse Cheryl's point that it's not just education, it's kind of internalizing it so that it's part of you. And I should say that the one hopeful sign in Sri Lanka is that, I mean, I've been speaking at various events last week, and I've been struck by the fact that the older people are so cynical and skeptical, and it's the younger people who are asking the really good questions. So that sort of gives one a little bit of hope. I've been sounding so pessimistic. I thought I should make that point. But about people, I mean, I think there are a lot of issues that we need to unbundle. So I want to clarify that I'm not necessarily saying that there needs to be a kind of strong democracy or direct democracy and that's the solution. I actually think that, you know, in countries in this part of the world, we probably need representative democracy, but the challenge is how to make those who represent us more responsive to us, right? So there's an interesting debate, as you know, on this, and I think we need to talk a little bit more about that. You know, and I don't know about the judiciary, Tom, you asked that question, you know, whether, you know, public opinion, academic criticism, you know, all that, we need to sort of think of strategies to put a little bit more pressure on our judges so that they don't engage in that type of total abdication of responsibility. And there too, I'm not necessarily advocating an activist judiciary, and I'm certainly prepared to accept that in times of national emergency or whatever, judges could very well decide to exercise a certain amount of restraint and have a kind of deference to the executive. But I think what has happened in Sri Lanka is in a completely different category. It doesn't even amount to that. And a quick point on Richard's point. Your point is very well taken, Richard, about supporting democratic governments. But the experience in Sri Lanka is that part of the problem is we had a so-called democratic government which was so incompetent and so ineffectual that part of our problem is that there's a kind of reaction against that kind of government. And so the price of failure, when you have a government that is willing to stick to the rule of the law, follow constitutional you know, governance, and if it fails, then you really strengthen the arguments of those who want to have a kind of dictatorship for development model.
Thank you, Rohan. I think we have two people with their hands raised, Ella and Ramdas. So Ella, I'll take you first.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to our panelists for their very important sharing. Just a quick addition regarding the issue of independent institutions and constitutional design that to follow up Cheryl's comments. I think in the case of the Philippines, of course, we are still at the stage where we are discussing what would be appropriate institutional designs for the Philippines. But at this point, when we talk about independent institutions that are in place, we do have a lot of independent institutions in place. And I think what is important at this point to tie up some of the points already mentioned here based on the experience of the Philippines is that until now, we still need more public information and public support, but we do see in the case of the Philippines during the pandemic how different groups are actually pressuring local governments, the judiciary, and supporting institutions, independent institutions like the Commission on Human Rights to actually fulfill their mandate. So in that sense, even younger, the point about hope is that we do have younger people who were not yet born when we had the Marcos martial law and dictatorship, who are now actually very vocal and supporting a lot of these institutions and reminding many institutions of their constitutional duty. So I think that's an important point. It's important to strengthen the institutions, particularly the independent institutions, but we do need more public information, and we also need to protect the rights of people who are also pushing and actually reminding these institutions what their roles are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Such an important point. I'll hand over to Ramdas.
I just want to make the point that one form of accountability is basically the popular vote. And since the pandemic started, I'm aware of at least 2 instances where there have been national elections. South Korea is one, where the incumbent party came back to power probably with an increased majority. The other was Singapore, which had done a reasonably good job on COVID, yet they lost a lot of seats and their popular vote shrank by about 10%. So I also want to point to Thailand, which has handled the pandemic pretty well, where street protests and demonstrations have become the norm now for a variety of reasons. Young people are coming out to make a point. Talking about India specifically, where popular votes is going to count is, the national vote is about 4 years away, but regional, state-level elections are due. So 2 major states, Bihar and West Bengal, which have about 200 million people, will likely go to the polls within the next 6 months. So are they going to punish the incumbent or the incumbent party at the national or central level or the regional or state level? So those are the questions which are going to emerge, because in one of the states, Bihar, the central party is an ally in the government at the local level. And in the other state, the opposition is in charge of the state level government. So how those politics and popular votes play out remains to be seen. But I do want to point out that popular vote is one way in which we can determine or look at the accountability question.
Thank you, Ramdas. Such an important point. And I think it brings up the issue, again, of accessibility to institutions, doesn't it? In terms of, you can have public opinion about institutions, but they also have to be able to access them and have a real voice. And when we think about courts, for example, it sort of depends on who actually has a say, who's able to access the top court, for example, to challenge the constitutionality of a law or measure. Thinking of India, we have a question in front of us here asking about how the government isn't considering any proposals of the Congress party leader, Mr. Gandhi, to control the pandemic. And the questioner asks, is there any solution that the international community can bring to ensure that those proposals get heard? That's an interesting one. We haven't spoken much yet about international institutions, but is there any sort of intervention that international actors can achieve? And is it legitimate if they do so? I'll ask you that question first, Ramdas, what your view of that question is, because it's focused on India.
Okay, India is in one of those phases where a single party is dominant at the center. And generally, when you look at India's experience, whenever that happens, hubris sets in. So you have a single party dominant at the center, which is exercising its executive powers willy-nilly. So that's an important fact to keep in mind. Parliament is the legislative branch is sort of fused with the executive branch. So it's very difficult for a fragmented opposition to actually function optimally under those kind of circumstances. So that's a second factor to keep in mind. The third thing to do is, generally when you have crisis, the judiciary sort of defers to the executive. And I think that pattern is playing out in India too. They haven't really taken a hard look at some of the decisions the government has taken and looked at the constitutionality or the legal basis of some of these actions, especially actions which are being implemented at the regional or state level. As far as the opposition is concerned, speaking specifically of the Congress party, which was mentioned here, the Congress is going through a phase where there are a lot of internal divisions. They don't have a lot of seats in parliament. And generally, the national opposition is fragmented because each regional or state level has its own party, which is represented in parliament. And the Congress is not going to represent these states. So how this plays out in the medium and short term, I think the status quo is going to remain. In the long term, I don't know, because India has gone through different twists and turns over the last 50 years.
So a follow-up question is, what do you think would happen? What would the reaction be from the government if any international actor even tried to broach the subject of you should listen more to opposition parties in Parliament?
In the short and medium term, nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to happen.
I mean, this seems to be a strong theme in this discussion, is the hegemonic executive, or the increasingly hegemonic executive. And we've seen that during the pandemic, haven't we? We've seen, I mean, one of the elephants in the room when we're talking about Asia Pacific is the US, of course, as a Pacific power. And when we've seen how, in particular, the Trump administration has reacted and tweeted against the WHO, for example, the letter he sent and so on, that places international institutions in an even more precarious position than they were before. We've seen the WHO had to sort of publicly ask member states to stop politicizing the pandemic. We saw that international expression of support for the WHO at the World Public Health Assembly. What do you think, in the current circumstances, these trends that we're seeing at the national level across the region, how do you think they're changing how national governments are going to interact with international actors from this point onward? Has it made interaction harder? Has it raised the risks of genuine backlash from governments to international organizations? I might just put that to Rohan first, and seek everybody else's views then.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I think, well, speaking for the United Nations, I think the UN has got pretty used to this kind of pushback and pressure. And as I mentioned in my paper, I think the UN leadership has got to be creative and skillful in how it engages. So with respect to the question about health policy, you know, it's the way in which it is done. I made the point that health is seen as generally non-threatening by governments. And maybe a quiet word to the Minister of Health, you know, about the government's response. It'll be totally out of the public eye, but that might have an impact. And I'm reminded of the fact that many years ago in Sri Lanka, WHO and UNFPA were able to exert a certain amount of pressure on the government with respect to how they responded to HIV/AIDS, and make sure that their policy responses were compatible with human rights and international human rights norms. But it was all done outside the public arena, and I think we've got to recognize that sometimes the United Nations is much more effective in that kind of discreet, behind the scenes lobbying, persuasion. You know, so I just like to flag that as something that we need to bear in mind.
Thanks, Rohan, because that was something that was very striking from your paper. You made the point that from the Secretary General to agency head to personnel across the UN, they can draw on universal norms as they're presented, that cut across national governments' own view of things. And it's really interesting that you've just presented that as not necessarily a clash, but more a sort of process of persuasion. Does anybody want to pick up on that point?
I actually think that this could be a bit of a watershed moment for the relations between states and institutions, and Rohan's paper picks this up as well. I mean, it's not as if the relationship was so great before. In fact, it was a bit messy. And there's some respects in which this pandemic and the response to it has cast light both on the behaviour of states and on the behaviour of international institutions. So I was very struck by the Secretary General saying so bluntly yesterday, or whenever it was, Rohan, you know, something's got to be done about the Security Council. I mean, it's so patently obvious that that's a problem. I have no idea how you actually go about fixing it, but it's sooner or later it's got to be tackled. So maybe this is a moment when we can really think quite creatively and not in an adversary way, but creatively about how the world should operate. There will be international institutions, there will be states, What's the most productive relationship between them?
I think it's such an important question. I mean, one thing we've been discussing at the School of Government is how difficult the relationships have been between the two superpowers and the WHO. But what you see when you take a step back is just how many countries were able to come together to produce communiques and so on in support of the WHO. So, you know, the narrative that multilateralism is dead is absolutely not true, and people are just looking for perhaps a better way to have effective multilateral. Amanda, did you put your hand up there? No. So we have a number of questions still rolling in. We have a question regarding India. Do you think that COVID-19 has increased the religious racism that government uses to increase their popularity? Is a question we've received. I think that we can reformulate that question to a certain extent and ask, you know, do you think there is independent institutions could have done more to protect minorities, for example, religious minorities, in the COVID-19 pandemic response in India? Ramdas, what do you think?
There was an attempt in the beginning, sometime in March, April, where to what they call in India communalize the situation, because the spread of the virus was associated with a particular religious community. And attendees at that particular event spread out all over India. And then the initial wave of cases came from clusters associated with that event. Just as one portion of the country started talking about the religious significance of this, another portion of the country said, no, you can't do this. So eventually it just washed out. It may be lying beneath the surface, but I haven't seen any communal or religious oriented or anything specifically targeting religious communities or religious minorities in India pertaining to the COVID in the last several months. But certainly there was an attempt early on.
Thank you, Ramdas. Jiunn-rong.
Well, let me jump in and respond to this minority protection issue, not necessarily religious group, but I'm very concerned about one phenomenon, that is with the flow of information, particularly migrant workers. They work in many jurisdictions. And imagine with these migrant workers, if they become illegal, they, you know, and unregistered, and they are on the run on many occasions, at the same time they still have to work. Let's say in this recent experience, in Taiwan, we have like about 50,000 undocumented foreign workers from Southeast Asia. There was one case, one confirmed case of COVID-19, and then the society began to wonder, well, are they the most vulnerable group, and how are we going to deal with that? So society began to debate about this, but people like us are very concerned whether they will be stigmatized because they actually try to hide. They are the one who never get access to medical and also government help. So I was very concerned, and I was happy that in the end, the government and society take a very soft measure by saying that they render tremendous contribution to the society. Even some of them, although they are not registered, but they still work for health care for many elderly, and that's why they have a grand pardon for them, during even during the pandemic. I say coming out, and we will help. We have some sort of measure to do that instead of trying to crack them down. Of course, there was some argument about that some people ask the government, try to arrest them, because they are dangerous and they may become the problem. But in the end, they take a very soft measure. And I have been very concerned about this kind of issues in the other jurisdictions. And I think once they get become unlawful and they are marginalized, and and they are not represented in the parliament. They are represented by our society, and they even not get access to the court or to other kind of assistance. So this is my concern and question, kind of through back to the yeah, to all of you. Maybe it's an issue for our attention.
Absolutely, it's so interesting because this seems to be where underrepresentation and a not fully inclusive political structures actually meet the even more negative trend of ethnicization of the state, that the state belongs to one ethnic community to the exclusion of others. And is it the role, or ideally is it the role, of independent institutions at both the national and the international level to try and shore up the power of the excluded, the minorities, those who aren't represented fully or even at all in the national political structures? Does anybody want to take up that question?
Jacqueline here.
Hey, Jacqueline.
Hi. If you don't mind, I thought I wanted to jump into a little bit. Thank you everyone for these wide-ranging views, fascinating stuff, and obviously there's a lot to think about. But I wanted to jump in on what Jiunn-rong was saying about vulnerable groups. I think one thing that the pandemic should be showing us is that we're only as strong as the most vulnerable among us. And that the pandemic, you know, the disease doesn't sort of care if you are rich or you are poor and so on and so forth. But of course, it does also show that the inequalities within society, those who have access to healthcare versus those who don't. And then it's a question of whether the healthcare system that we see in respective countries are the kind that is open to all, or, you know, is really much more stratified. And I think that Singapore, for instance, has been severely criticized for its migrant worker situation and how the fact that the numbers were very high among the migrant workers. There are some issues with that, for instance, in the way we report the numbers, right? We call those that are outside of the dormitories, the migrant workers' dormitories, community cases, and then the dormitory cases. So there is a bit of that language issue there. But I think even then there is some recognition that really it is not a problem that we can simply just put aside. We are affected by immigrants, migrant workers in our midst who are vulnerable. And if they are affected by this disease, we are affected as well. So I think that is one positive thing that could be coming, that, you know, could come out. This idea that there is a community and solidarity, and that, you know, we're really only as strong as our most vulnerable. But at the same time, I think that there's another trend that we're seeing, which is that the technocratic approach to a lot of the problems that we have can also be highly problematic, because it's not premised upon sort of strong values of equality and so on. If it's not based on these strong values of equality and solidarity. So for instance, one of the trends we're seeing is this insularity, economic insularity, you know, sack the foreigners, save our economy kind of idea, which is very problematic. And yet, you know, seems to be, you know, we see this in the United States, for instance, the withdrawal of certain types of visas. We see this in different countries. So I see sort of these different trends that which is also being fueled by actions from sort of more technocratic approaches to how we deal with the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. So much to think about there, but yes, I mean, I see a lot of talk about how technocracy can be our savior. And we do have to be very careful, don't we, about the rehabilitation of experts, as some people see it under COVID, could swing the pendulum too far in the other direction. And we need balance. Does anybody want to pick up on Jacqueline's points? I was struck, for example, Rohan, in your paper, that you made the point that intervention by the UN on the social and economic side is seen as generally welcome, whereas intervention that's seen as political is seen as more problematic and can lead to clashes. And that sort of, in a strange way, replicates the technocracy political divide at the national level. Do you think COVID has sort of blurred those boundaries, if they were proper thick boundaries in the first place?
Yes, I think it has, because I know certainly in Sri Lanka, the UN leadership has been sort of caught, as it were, because as you rightly imply in your question, Tom, I mean, there's so much overlap between the public health response and issues of constitutionalism and the rule of law. But notwithstanding that, I do think that it's in the interest of the UN leadership in Sri Lanka to sort of disentangle the two where possible and continue to engage. And that is the UN's sort of primary sort of mindset. I mean, you can criticize it, but that seems to be their strategy, engagement, whatever the nature of the government. And that I guess that it could sometimes work to everyone's advantage. I'd just like to add, I mean, I don't know whether Leena will agree with me, but certainly the point that was made about can international organizations do more to address the concerns and the aspirations of the vulnerable. I mean, I think it all depends on context. It all depends on seizing the moment when you have an opportunity. And I do think that in Nepal, International IDEA and the UN did their bit to push to try and ensure that with respect to the design of the Constitution of 2015, the concerns and the aspirations of marginalized groups were addressed. Of course, it was relatively easy because that was what the whole civil war and the peace agreement was about, but it could have easily been forgotten. And I think that the partnership with the political groups who were advocating that really helped to ensure that, that those issues were not totally forgotten when the final constitution was produced.
Thank you, Rohan. I see that the Secretary General of International IDEA has joined us. Welcome. Now, we've just been speaking about how international institutions can possibly act to help protect the vulnerable at the national level. We've been having a very wide-ranging discussion about just what independent institutions can do at the national and international level, especially when faced with quite strong hegemonic executives. I know we're going to hear from you closing out the event, but I'd be very interested to hear your views, even off the top of your head.
Well, I mean, good. I think it's afternoon, right, in Australia. Yes. And wherever you are, it's a pleasure to be with you and to be joining this discussion. I, of course, joined the discussion late, but I think there are several things that international organizations such as ours can do in this kind of situation. When I would say the primary duty, and I think I'm jumping the gun here because this is one of the things that I was going to mention in my final remarks. Our primary duty is to create a protective network for democracy globally. The headwinds are so severe. They were severe before the pandemic, and they are even more severe now, that I think this is the time to create global networks to protect democracy. And we can do that, at least from the standpoint of IDEA, in several different ways. I mean, one of the things that we do is we facilitate knowledge, a experience of different kinds to actors on the ground. We put together different strands of policy practice globally that is massively important. For instance, and here I just mentioned one example. I mean, one of the issues that has come to the fore in this pandemic is the question of state capacity. as a crucial variable for countries to deal with the challenges thrown at them by the pandemic. Well, state capacity, that is the ability of states to respond in an efficacious way to the pandemic, depends, among many other things, on institutional design. Well, and that's the kind of stuff that you guys have been talking about for the past few days. Well, this is the kind of area on which international idea can have an impact, putting together different strands of evidence and facilitating that knowledge to actors. But there's also a role in terms of advocacy. I mean, just speaking out in favor of democracy. And we tried to do that a few weeks ago, and we continue to do that. But we, as you're aware, we put out a public letter with a very large group of organizations from all over the world called a call to defend democracy, which ended up being signed by over 500 global leaders and so on. So that's another way to go about it. And finally, and this is perhaps the silver lining in all this, I think, and again, I'm jumping the gun, you're making me say my remarks before my time, but there's a silver lining in this, which is that the very magnitude of the crisis is giving us an opportunity, or giving many countries the opportunity to rethink their social contract. And I think it's incumbent upon us to push countries, to nudge countries to the extent possible towards processes of broad-based, wide-ranging social and political dialogue to make that transformation possible. And I think IDEA and the UN and other organizations have a track record of helping countries to create that sort of fora to have that discussion. So I, you know, at the very least, off the top of my head, I can see 3 different roles for institutions such as ours. And I'll leave it at that, because otherwise I won't have anything to say at the end other than thanking all of you very profusely.
Thank you so much. And you've really touched on so many themes that have actually come out of this discussion this afternoon so far. You've perfectly set up the next audience question, which was in the queue, which was, what do people think of the value of international and regional alliances, whether courts, fourth branch institutions, or judges? Can they support these institutions within a country at moments of crisis or authoritarianism? So I'd be really interested to hear your views on that. I'm going to direct it to Cheryl first. I would just be interested to know what you think about that.
Hold on, do it again. I thought we just had that discussion. Just repeat the question, Tom.
This is more about the role of transnational alliances of fourth branch institutions on the ground across multiple countries. So what's their value, whether they're courts, judges, other types of fourth branch institutions, and can they support countries that are undergoing a crisis or authoritarianism?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to answer that in the abstract. Obviously, the transnational networks, whether regional or international, but certainly regional, can be very effective in some contexts. I just wonder how that's playing out in the context of this pandemic, though. If we focus on courts and other independent institutions, I just wonder to what extent those networks have been really operating in any significant way at all during the pandemic. But I do think where the networks and transnational activity has been important has been in relation to the point that Kevin just raised about capacity, national capacity. So I don't know how effective Australian assistance to some Pacific states have been, for example, and to Papua New Guinea and so on. But I do get the impression that that's been very important and that it will continue to be extremely important going forward as the vaccine starts being rolled out. And I think that the agreement that seems to have been reached by a very large number of countries about supporting the dissemination of the vaccine and the development of plans to ensure that it's administered in a way that's equitable, to pick up one of the points that Jacqueline made, is going to be really important.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. I think I'm mindful of time, so I think it would be an opportune time to get your and Leena's reflections on the 4 webinars before Kevin closes us out. So seeing as you're still up, I'll call on you or Leena.
Leena, I think. Leena, you going first? Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tom. Well, what a fascinating forum we have had, revealing the richness of the experiences in Asia and the Pacific region. And maybe for the benefit of those who may have joined us only from this last session, just to state again that our this year's forum, Melbourne Forum overall theme was representation in democracies during emergencies, and we were using the COVID-19 pandemic as our lens. And we discussed emergency powers, lawmaking and accountability, multi-level governance, role of independent institutions and of international institutions, discussing 17 country experiences over this series of 4 webinars. What I would like to do is just to provide a couple of overall observations, and then introduce and launch 2 papers published in the Melbourne Forum series of constitutional insights, and then just to talk a little bit about what next. A lot of our discussions, and for very obvious reasons, focused on the challenges and setbacks to democracy during this pandemic. Really what struck me was how these presentations also highlighted many positive innovations, institutional and otherwise, that countries have made during these challenges. No question, there are issues, and this ongoing emergency has certainly proven stressful, also from the democracy and representation point of view, revealing at times inadequacies in legal frameworks. We heard from the Solomon Islands, executives taking advantage of extraordinary powers in Thailand or Philippines, or simply bypassing the representative institutions, as in Sri Lanka and as we heard today in Fiji. And then again, we have also witnessed democratic innovations from Taiwan to Australia, successful elections in South Korea, Singapore, elsewhere, increased transparency in decision-making, including taking the opposition along in New Zealand, and at least recognizing the existence of the opposition in Singapore. And we have seen the heightened awareness amongst people, an increase in demand for reforms, again in Thailand, in Philippines, parties putting aside the political party differences for a while, Timor-Leste, or then not, as in Malaysia. And in fact, most countries we have discussed have both positive and negative lessons to take on. And obviously, the increased role of military in the response for this pandemic is very worrying. And we heard, perhaps not surprisingly at all, from experiences from Pakistan and Thailand in this regard, with long legacies of military's role in politics, but also from, similarly, from Sri Lanka. Then again, while in this forum we did not discuss Myanmar, it is to be noted that their military has not taken a prominent role in response to the pandemic, something that would have been a default position only 6-7 years ago. There was an interesting question about the role of culture, or what difference the underlying culture makes in terms of government and citizen response. I think it was Akiko's question in our very first session. And a lot of countries have reported being used to loud executive action, not least in the Philippines. And the kind of legality and constitutionality of those actions comes as an afterthought. We learned the experience with previous pandemics, be it SARS or MERS or bushfires, mattered a lot in terms of whether the infrastructure and the processes were in place, but also in terms of the civic attitude towards the response. It was also interesting what is perceived as a rights violation. In some places, only very serious violations are taken note of. In others, economic rights are prominent, like in Japan, or freedom of movement. I must say, as a European, I have to say I've been surprised how calm the Australians are about the fact that they cannot freely leave their country. Also, what mattered was if the country was already in crisis when the pandemic hit. This also makes a big difference. Timor-Leste had budgetary crisis, Malaysia's parliamentary crisis, Sri Lanka in perpetual crisis, as it was referred to earlier. Also, why federalism and multi-level governance matter, and what is the role of representation there. We heard in Nepal the importance of newly introduced federal structures were eventually acknowledged and made use of also by the earlier reluctant federalists in Kathmandu. We heard about the negative tensions between center and the provinces, how they were revealed in Pakistan, as well as what could be called positive tension in Australia. And there perhaps one conclusion is that multi-level cooperation requires political consensus building, otherwise it feels like a dictate from central government. And there perhaps the spirit of true consultation and coordination was lacking in India, whereas in Australia, federalism provided an opportunity for flexibility in applying some of the guidelines. I have to mention one of the important pieces of advice that came from Ramdas in reference to Indian experience and applicable anywhere, which was follow the money. Who holds the purse strings in multi-level government makes a big difference to who responds and how effectively. And often in emergencies, these decisions about huge amounts of funding are made with great speed and perhaps understandably so. However, important to make sure the public scrutiny and the role of auditor generals, etc., are secured. And this was discussed by many. I remember Ella mentioning this, noting that audits often come at later stage and damage may already be done. Before I finish, I would like to launch 2 papers published in our Melbourne Forum series of Constitutional Insights. There you are. These 2 are stemming from our last year forum, which focused on public participation in constitution building processes and took place in Yangon in Myanmar. First one, consultation, deliberation and decision making, authored by Anna Tijik, who also chaired the session on emergency powers and joins us today from Hong Kong. This issue examines the purpose of critiques of the different types and trends in public participation, including the rise of unofficial channels for direct participation in constitution building. Second brief is the inclusion of combatants in constitution building, authored again by Ana Cicic together with Sebastian Machado Ramirez. And this brief examines the what, why, and how to include combatants in constitution building processes, drawing from the experiences of Aceh, Bougainville, Mindanao, as well as of Afghanistan, Colombia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. So they are hereby launched and available from International IDEA website and also from the Melbourne Forum website. And the plan is that we will develop such insights from this year forum on representation as well. And we look forward to your thoughts and ideas for possible topics. I think one potential candidate relates to also what we discussed today regarding the role of Parliament and asking the question of what the role of representative bodies in 21st century should be, also in times of crisis in particular, recognizing that we are already living many other crises, including the climate one. And also, how does the horizontal accountability work in times of crisis, examining particularly the role of courts and independent institutions as we did today. But do let us know what you think, what the topics you would wish to read more about are, and we try to oblige. This was our first time organizing this Melbourne Forum online, and one thing is for sure, it can be done. And we obviously lose the sight, conversations, and unexpected connections of the face-to-face meetings. But I think at the same time, this format allows obviously for larger participation, which has been great. So for the future, as is the case with so many other events, it's probably a mix of the both worlds. And the trick is to make sure how do we get the best of the both worlds done. And as mentioned in my opening remarks, one purpose of the Melbourne Forum is to be of use for the policymakers in particular country contexts where we meet. And in past, it has been in the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and we would wish not to lose that aspect of the forum, be it online or offline. Our Secretary General will deliver our institutional thanks, but at this point, just want to thank everyone who had worked behind the screen and made this webinar series such a smooth affair. Aftab Hussain and Catherine Taylor from Melbourne Uni, and of course Charmaine Fernandez, our coordinator, who has been curating, editing, uploading all the papers, and Liz Hicks, who is drafting the forum report, which promises to be a very interesting read and will be soon available. And also my thanks to my colleague Amanda Gasparil for all the possible support with the briefs and with this forum. And my thanks to all of you who presented, chaired, and participated our Melbourne Forum 2020. Thank you, everyone. And back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Leena. And I'll hand over to Cheryl before we have our closing remarks from the Secretary General.
Thanks, Tom, very much. Well, colleagues, this year, as you know, the theme of the forum has been the impact of COVID-19 on constitutional democracies. And we've been very interested to understand in particular how democratic representation has worked during this extraordinary time. And this is certainly unlikely to be the last time that the forum takes up the issue of democratic representation. It's one of the most critical issues for democracy in this particular historical moment, for the reasons that Rohan Edrisinha explained so effectively in his written paper and then in his remarks to the webinar today. So I won't try to draw together all the threads of these extraordinary discussions that have taken place over these 4 Thursdays in September. But the key themes coincide with the organising principles of the webinars, of which Leena reminded us: the design and use of constitutional emergency powers, the role of legislatures, the contributions of multiple levels of democratic government, and the roles of other institutions beyond representation, supplementing and complementing those of representatives during such extraordinary times. As you heard from Leena, one way in which we seek to preserve the understanding generated by the forum in a more lasting way is through that series of briefs described as constitutional insights, 2 of which have been launched today. There will be more such briefs, and I join with Leena in encouraging any of you who have views about the way we should cut this subject matter up. We would be very interested in what you have to say on that. My own instinct at the moment is to develop the briefs around the 4 webinars that we have just experienced, maybe providing some more focus on the 4th, deciding between courts and other independent institutions. But I'd like just to make 2 general comments about what we've learned from these webinars, and my takeaways, I think, correspond very closely to those of Leena's and perhaps Kevin too. First of all, Melbourne Forum 2020 has once again reinforced the diversity of experiences across the regions, diversity in the substance of constitutions and in the ways in which they operate in practice. In some instances, that diversity is attributable to innovation. In many, it responds to differences in context, which may nevertheless offer insights for others elsewhere if comparative projects are designed. And Jiunn-rong spoke to the benefit of those in his earlier remarks. So just by way of some of the examples of this diversity, think, for example, of the vast differences in the constitutional emergency provisions that were revealed over the past 4 weeks, or even in differences in practice as to whether recourse was had to emergency provisions at all. Think also of the very different ways in which democracies have sought to strike the difficult balance between managing the immediate response to the health crisis on the one hand and maintaining principled democratic forms, including respect for civil liberties on the other. And I was particularly struck by these differences in reading Jiunn-rong's paper for today. My second general comment, and this does very much echo what Leena just said, is that many of, although of course no means all of these experiences have been positive. There has been justified apprehension around the world that the pandemic will be yet another catalyst for undermining democracy by augmenting executive authority and eroding both political and legal accountability. And in too many cases that's happened, as many of the cases that we've discussed in the forum show. But in at least some of the cases explored in the forum, there's a much better story of sensitivity to the potential for concentration of power, of creativity in preserving democratic forms and practices at a difficult time, of a resurgence in the vitality of multi-level government, and of a new appreciation of the potential of international institutions and their relationships with states. So all this suggests to me that any program of work for the future should not only seek to understand the cases in which there's been democratic backsliding with a view to focused remedial action, however difficult that may be, but also to treat the positive cases as an encouraging source of creative energy on which stronger democratic forms might be built. So let me close with thanks to a great many people. First and foremost to the presenters in these 4 webinars. You've all given us so much to think about, and we greatly appreciate your involvement and commitment at what is a difficult time for everyone. We hope that we can come back to you if we have further questions about particular issues as the writing of the briefs proceeds. Secondly, thanks to those of you who registered as the audience. One of the advantages of this online format has been the ability to engage an even wider community. It's been great to be able to do so, and we thank you for your presence and your comments and your questions. We hope to stay in touch with you for future events. Third, and very importantly, our thanks to the administrators at Melbourne Law School and in all the institutions from which many of the presenters have spoken, who've worked behind the scenes to ensure that the technology functioned for us. It's done so almost without a hitch, and we're very grateful to you. And last but not least, thank you to all my colleagues on the IDEA and Contransnet teams who collaborated in planning the forum, who chaired and participated in webinars, and who have supported the endeavour throughout. I should mention in particular Charmaine Rodriguez, who's managed the entire forum from the Contransnet end so effectively. And as always, it's been a pleasure for us to work with IDEA in this way. And as always, the results have been productive and satisfying. So it's particularly appropriate in these circumstances and an honour that we have the Secretary General of International IDEA with us today. And I look forward very much to his closing remarks. Thanks, Tom. Back to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. I was so eager to hear from the Secretary General that I pushed him for a preview already. So
yeah,
now,
well.
now we get the main event. So over to Secretary General of International IDEA, Mr. Kevin Casas-Zamora.
Thank you so much, Tom. Well, that was two for the price of one, you see. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Tom, for supporting our work on the global monitor in COVID-19 and democracy, and also, as I mentioned before, on the call to defend democracy. And also for inviting me to close this truly remarkable event. I mean, this year's Melbourne Forum was the fifth in its series, and it truly is a very important initiative for international IDEA in Asia and the Pacific. So on behalf of International IDEA, I would like to start by thanking our partners at the Constitution Transformation Network at Melbourne University, and in particular, Cheryl Saunders, the convener of the network, who also happens to be a highly esteemed friend of IDEA's and a former member of IDEA's Board of Advisors. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually, and my gratitude goes to you for all your support. I would also like to acknowledge International IDEA's team in Asia Pacific, in particular, our regional director, Leena, Rikkilä, Tamang, as well as all the distinguished presenters, chairs, and participants of this year's forum for the insightful presentations and vivid exchanges. For us at International IDEA, the topic of this event couldn't be more relevant or timely, as issues of political representation, elections, and constitutional processes are at the heart of our work, at the heart of our knowledge production, and also at the heart of our technical assistance around the world. These issues only become more pressing in the context of emergencies, as this webinar series has made clear. In a time when the need for shared knowledge and experiences is greater than ever, it was incredibly valuable to follow some of the discussions. Among many other insights, the debates held here revealed how remarkably different the legal frameworks for deploying a state of emergency regulations in the region are, how federal and state levels made very different assessments for the need to implement lockdowns and other emergency measures, how important it proved for governments to follow due process and the rule of law to communicate effectively with the public and to cooperate with the opposition. How important the roles of parliaments, the opposition, and the media were to provide efficient responses, oversight, and ensure political accountability. And finally, how the crisis brought about, and this has been mentioned here, brought about positive political innovations, more transparency, more inclusive policy debates, and in some cases, higher voter turnout. Of course, these few examples don't do justice at all to all the nuances and insights from the discussions, but I would like to thank you all for generously sharing your country's experiences, what worked and what didn't, what to look out for and what to do better next time. You've made us all a bit wiser in terms of how to best respond to emergencies without compromising on democratic principles. We are indeed learning from this crisis every day. And here I would like to share with you in turn some of the main and obvious lessons that I've gleaned over the past few months. I've learned that this virus hits those with pre-existing conditions the hardest. And this is true for individuals as much as it is for countries. This crisis has been unforgiving in exposing pre-existing ills in democracies all over the world. Leadership deficits, social inequalities, polarization, weak governance structures, underinvestment in public goods, and a very serious erosion of trust in political institutions. I've learned that the quality of democratic governance matters, and in a very tangible way saves lives. The pandemic has proved how important the defining elements of a working democracy, such as respecting the rule of law, engaging in evidence-based decision-making, seeking consensus with political opponents, protecting the free flow of information, and nurturing the open engagement between government and society are in times of crisis. In fact, the crisis has made the concept of good governance very concrete and relevant for many. As one of the members of the forum pointed out, many more people now realize the importance of paying close attention to who they elect, of monitoring government's actions, of curating official information, of investing in improving state capacity, accountability, and service delivery. At the same time, we are also realizing beyond doubt the detrimental effects reaped by societies where all those elements are weak or plainly absent. And this is not abstract. It rather is clearly borne by the evidence. I mean, while it is true that overall Asia has managed the health crisis reasonably well, having learned from the SARS and MERS pandemics, the diversity in responses and outcomes among democracies in the region is there for all to see. As in other parts of the world, we can see that high-performing democracies, the likes of Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, in general, seem to have managed the crisis very well, both from a public health and democracy perspective. At the same time, the pandemic has revealed or emphasized negative trends in weaker democracies in the region, as in the case of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, or the Philippines. I've also learned the importance of international cooperation and multilateral responses when faced with disruptions of this scale. Dealing successfully with global long-term challenges such as recurring pandemics, climate change, or the technological transformation of our societies will require more collaboration, more communication, and more commitment from all national governments, multilateral organizations, and the global civil society. And the truth is that on the multilateral and international level, there is some serious soul searching to do. This is a pandemic that the international community has been unable to prevent and properly contain, despite the multiple warnings it refused to heed in the recent past and the lessons that previous smaller crises yielded. And we have seen, at least in this initial months, the opposite of a common, coordinated, and concerted approach, which is the only way to deal with global and transnational challenges. Perhaps most of all, I have learned that there is nothing inevitable about the advance and sustainability of democracy. Democracy is neither created nor maintained by itself. It is something that requires continuous vigilance, dedication, and support. This pandemic is strengthening the already severe headwinds that democracy was facing worldwide. If you care, as I do, about the future of democracy, this is the time to build global coalitions to protect it. And in fact, we need to go beyond defending democracy. The very magnitude of this crisis is opening up opportunities to reinvent democracy for a new era. And we need to seize those opportunities with both hands. What should better democratic systems look like after the pandemic? Well, they should be based on a new social contract focused on reducing inequality, including gender inequalities, focused on leaving no one behind, especially the most vulnerable ones, and committed to investing in public health, education, job creation, and social protection. Better democracies should be based on robust institutions to protect the rule of law and checks and balances, capable of enhancing accountability and transparency, and of fighting corruption and impunity, which is essential to rebuild public political trust, which is currently in short supply. Better democracies should be based in strong parliaments and political parties, inclusive deliberation processes, and safe and ample spaces for public dialogue and civic participation. Better democracies should embody the commitment to invest in technological innovation, inclusive digitalization, and network infrastructure for all. Better democracies should enshrine the political incentives and practices to better cope with the multi-generational challenges of climate change and the sustainable development agendas best crystallized in the 2030 agenda. And let us be unequivocal about this. Without sustainable democracy, there will not be sustainable development. These are but some of the lessons I've gleaned. I certainly hope that together we'll continue to learn from this pandemic. I encourage you to make use of the comparative global expertise that is available. And on behalf of International IDEA, I pledge to you our best effort to continue developing the databases, reports, briefs, and toolkits that can support, guide, and strengthen democracy during the pandemic and beyond. But here, I also plead to you to help us build this body of knowledge by sharing with us and the international community your success stories, your challenges, and the lessons that you've picked up along the way. Asia and the Pacific is a huge and diverse region, and there is much the world can learn from understanding its very diverse experiences. And this is what we're all doing here at this event. Shaking off our perplexity in the face of the challenges that have been thrown at us to find the glimpses of truth that can help us navigate these uncertain times. If we put our minds to it, we can transform the current crisis into a catalyst for change and a unique opportunity to rethink democracy for the future. Nothing less is called from us. In this season of darkness, we have a duty to protect democratic values, practices, and institutions. The best way to do that is to prepare them for the new world that will emerge from the ashes of this crisis. This will take creativity, inquisitive spirit, and willingness to learn from all countries and regions around the world. And I take International IDEA's role in all of this to be an instrument to accelerate learning, to turn lessons into political action, to help all of you expand the frontiers of what's possible, and thus renew the unextinguishable promise of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those powerful and inspiring reflections. I couldn't agree more that it's not just about defending democracy, but reinventing democracy. We're really honored to have had you closing this webinar series for the Melbourne Forum this year. It's a testament to the strength of the collaboration between the Constitution Transformation Network and International IDEA. So it just falls to me to thank you once again, to thank Leena and Cheryl, all of my colleagues, everybody who's been involved, the speakers, panelists, and audience. And I'll finish with two notes. One is that the videos from all of the webinars are available on the Constitution Transformation Network website, and the video of this webinar will be available probably by next Wednesday. And finally, for those watching, an experience survey will pop up on your screen when the webinar finishes, so please do fill it out. It's important to us to get your feedback. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for such a fantastic Melbourne Forum this year.
Thanks, everyone.